Now, one of the key moments in the modern study of Deuteronomy was the recognition that there is an analogy between the way Deuteronomy is framed and treaty texts from the ancient Near East.
Yeah, this was something that we could not possibly have seen without comparative material.
Right, and the comparative material really only became available probably in the middle of the last century.
That's right. And I mean, as you can see, there's this wonderful moment in scholarship where a few things get published and then suddenly everybody can see it. But we're talking about treaties from ancient Turkey, Hittite treaties, and Mesopotamian ones, Assyrian and Babylonian treaties. And it turns out that there was, as there is, I think, probably today too, there's sort of a set, literary formula for how these treaties worked. And it makes all the sense in the world. There's a historical prologue. Here's our relationship. Yeah. Here's why we are here. Here's how we got here. And here is sort of your obligations to me. Here's sort of the statement of dependence, as it were. Right. These are treaties between an imperial king, really, and a minor vassal.
What we sometimes call vassal treaties.
That's right.
But they're not treaties between equal partners.
No. It's an imperial king and a conquered, often a conquered or could easily be conquered people. Yeah. Here's who we are. Here's what I expect from you. Here are the stipulations of the thing. That is, here's all the individual points that we're going to make. Here are the blessings and the curses. Should this be followed or not followed? Here's the invocation of witnesses, our various deities, and then in here's some things about. Okay, so here's some rules about where we're going to deposit the treaty, right? So I'll keep a copy, you keep a copy. How often are we going to read the treaty? We're going to make sure this treaty gets read, by both parties once a year, right, so that it's maintained.
Typically,
and known.
We're going to inscribe this on a stone and put it up somewhere.
And we know that they did because we found them.
Yeah.
So that whole structure, which makes perfect sense between two partners, is basically exactly the framework and the organization of Deuteronomy. Those first 11 chapters where Moses says, let me take you back and talk to you about, we left Horeb and we went through the wilderness and all these things happened. That's remember God took you out of Egypt, all of that. That's the historical. And then you get the stipulations.
Then there's a very nice kind of recapitulation of it, the historical prologue, if you like, in chapter 26, where at the kind of Thanksgiving festival, they say, my father was a wandering army and went down to Egypt and so forth. And again, it's like a summary form. This becomes one of the most typical things in the whole Hebrew Bible, that summary of the history. When these treaties first came to light, the ones that initially impressed people were the Hittite ones from Turkey, and they were big on the historical prologue.
Yeah.
And some people said, aha, this shows that this does go back to the time of Moses, because that's when the Hittites were around.
Yeah.
That's when they would have had contact with them. But then it turned out that the Assyrians had basically the same shape of treaty. Yeah. Not as heavy maybe on the history, but they do a great job on the curses.
So to start there, right, there are what seem almost again verbatim curse formula in Deuteronomy and in these Assyrian texts. But there's more than that. There's one particular Assyrian treaty, which we sort of call the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon, which the details aren't particularly important, but it's datable, right? We know when it's from. It's from the 8th century. 7th century? 7th century. And there are parts, again, verbatim parts in the curses, and other places where Deuteronomy seems really to have copied word for word. Ironically, the place where you see that is most clearly, perhaps, is in the line where Deuteronomy says, and you shall add nothing to and take nothing away from this text.
Yes.
Which is funny because, of course, it's saying that in copying a different text that also said don't add to or take anything away. And while Deuteronomy is itself, a revision of earlier biblical law.
That's right. This is sometimes called the canonical formula.
Right.
Because then it gets used apropos of the Bible as a whole.
Yeah.
Especially by people who are adding or subtracting to it.
Right.
That's
Essentially, don't do to me what I did to these earlier texts.
Now, one of the most important points of analogy, I think, comes up in a passage in chapter 6 of Deuteronomy, what's called the Shema.
Yep.
Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. Now, this use of the word love somewhat ironically shows up in the vassal treaty of Esarhaddon. You shall love my son as Ashurbanipal. It's really a succession treaty. It's requiring people to swear allegiance to his son when he becomes king.
Yeah.
What does it mean to love Ashurbanipal?
Yeah, it comes up there and elsewhere. It's sort of, again, it's part of the treaty language of the ancient world. Love is not an emotional state or an emotional expression.
Yeah.
It is really, quite simply, loyalty. It's devoted singular loyalty. You are to love the king, and not love other kings. It's almost plays into the sort of the marriage metaphor, right?
Yeah.
You are supposed to be, in the same way that you're supposed to be married to only one spouse, and anything else is cheating. You're supposed to love your king, and not go follow other kings. And again, you have to think of this not as individuals. It's not an individual Israelite or an individual whoever who is being told to love a king. Right, these are treaties between kingdoms. So this vassal state is supposed to be loyal to only this one king. And we have to remember, this is a world in which there are multiple kingdoms and empires. So when the Assyrian emperor says, "You are to love me and my son," what it means is, and don't go making treaties or alliances with other kings, which one could. Then, so you shift that analogy to what's being said in the biblical text. You shall love the Lord your God. Well, if anybody in the ancient world who recognized this as a treaty would read love as treaty love, right? As loyalty.
Yeah.
You shall be loyal to and obligated to this God, and the inference is, and not to any of the other gods whom you might think to go running to.
So to a great degree, this quite central idea of love of God is something that's derived from a political analogy and with the Assyrians of all people.
And a polytheistic analogy.
I think it's a great example of post-colonialism, right, where you take over an idea of the ruling power and invert it. Some people would say that it's subverting the claim of the Assyrians. Probably, I think by the time this was promulgated, the Assyrians were no longer the dominant threat. But at the same time, I think it's part of the argument that this does go back to something close to the Assyrian era, when this kind of language still had resonance and meant something.
Yeah, certainly, they've done something very clever and creative here in taking a form that was otherwise exclusively about human kingship and human domination, and saying, for Israel, right? Israel has made its treaty not with any human king, be it Assyrian or otherwise, but instead with its deity.
Yeah. Now, something that follows on from that in chapter 13. If prophets, or those who divine by dreams, appear among you and promise you omens or portents, and the omens or the portents declared by them take place, and they say, let us follow other gods, you must not heed the words of the prophets. And if anyone secretly entices you, you mustn't follow them. And indeed, if you hear it said about one of the towns, well, okay, say it, but it's a warning against propaganda looking at prophets as agents, of other gods in this case.
Yeah.
And again, I think this is a political analogy. It's the same way that you mustn't listen to people who are trying to seduce you into loyalty to some other.
And again, here too, we have a good biblical analogy, right? In the Book of Kings, when the Babylonians, right, when they come a knocking, right, and they start trying to convince the populace to follow them, and the Israelite officials are like, please don't talk to the people.
Now, Deuteronomy doesn't have much time for prophets.
Nah.
Why not?
Deuteronomy, I think, understands that there are prophets out there, but for the most part, Deuteronomy wants to concentrate, I think, all authority within itself.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't have any. There are priests. There are priests in Deuteronomy, but their job is mostly to teach the law.
Yeah.
So I think Deuteronomy is, and this is sort of a broader aspect of Deuteronomy, is that it is the most self-aware book in the entire Bible. That is, it is aware of itself as a text, that it wants to be read and repeated and disseminated and not changed. It's self-aware in that sense.
It's really here, it seems to me, that you can begin to speak of the law, in that absolute sense, as the highest authority in the whole religion.
Sure. I mean, this is I think is where the law and also the book, right?
Yes.
This is where the idea of a book, of a text being the central expression of the religion or of the faith. Deuteronomy is the beginning of that.
So does it allow for prophets at all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can have prophets.
But on what condition?
But they have to
speak like Moses.
And which is to say, they have to be faithful to this law.
To this law.
The one you just read is a prophet comes along and tells you something that's against this law. This is more powerful than the prophet.
Exactly.
Even if they can do it with signs and all the things.
And it says in chapter 18, it says, "A prophet like me, the Lord will raise up."
Yep.
Now, this has often been read as predicting a particular individual, but I think it was really meant to be just a type.
Yep.
This is what a prophet ought to be like. And a prophet is one who preaches the law. And in some of the later literature, that's what prophets do. In the book of Chronicles, for example. And then you may say to yourself, how can we recognize a word that the Lord has not spoken? If a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the thing does not take place, the Lord didn't speak it. So it's a kind of disavowal of responsibility on the part of the Lord, that if anything doesn't quite work out.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest shift, the most striking one though, is what they do with the king.
Yeah.
Now, this is a big issue anyway, I think, with all of these laws. All the great codes we have from the ancient world, Hammurabi and such people, are all promulgated by kings. Kings were the law, really. None of that in the Bible. Now, probably at least some of these law codes that we've been talking about must have been promulgated or published, or whatever word one uses for it, under monarchy, at a time when there were kings. It's never the king who is given credit for it.
Right. Even the story from 2 Kings of Josiah, who is clearly given credit for taking in and reforming in line with Deuteronomy, the story is very clear that he couldn't possibly have written it. So what you have in chapter 17 then, where the only place in the book where we really get any reference to the way that the monarchy works is, as with the prophets, but even more starkly, I think, a king that is subservient to the law.
Right. So when you come into the land, and this is probably again alluding to the story we have in Samuel, and you say you want a king, so you may set one of your brethren over you. He must not acquire many horses for himself. You're not allowed to put a foreigner over you. He mustn't go back to Egypt. And he must not acquire many wives for himself. A little dig, maybe at Solomon.
Yeah.
Or else his heart will turn away. And silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. And it shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life. So you get this wonderful picture of the king, with his table beside his bed and a copy of the law, and he reads a chapter every night or something.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't dream of doing anything that wasn't approved by that law.
Yeah.
That's wishful thinking
On a
massive scale.
It certainly reverses the usual idea, which is that the law is subservient. The law is promulgated created by the king. Here, the king can do nothing that's not in the law.
Is it fair to call this a constitutional monarchy?
There's a history of scholarship that reads Deuteronomy as a sort of a constitutional form. The answer is no. But there is something very
there's something to it.
It goes to Deuteronomy's notion that its own itself as text is the governing force, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that we don't find really even in other law codes, even in other legal materials. It's not in Exodus, it's not in Leviticus, but this sense that this text will be repeated, right? Famously, right? You shall teach it to your children over and over again in Deuteronomy. There's provisions for its regular reading. It's going to be read to the public every 7 years at the festival. It's read to the king, right? The job of the priests, there's probably sacrifice, but they are the possessors of the law. They are the teachers of it. They are there to make rulings on its basis. There's nothing else like this. But as you said earlier, it is from that core idea that Deuteronomy has about itself that expands to cover the entirety of the text. Right? In chapter 31, we have this little toss-off line, right? Moses wrote down this whole Torah. Now, within Deuteronomy, it means Deuteronomy, right? Moses wrote down these laws that we just read. But as interpretations will, that expands. And now Moses is the writer of the whole thing. But just as Deuteronomy makes the text the center of, the central organizing principle, so that expands. And now it's the entire Pentateuch is law in that same sense. Yeah. And now we have a broader text that becomes the governing body of as it were, of Israel and of Judaism.
And the idea of the Mosaic covenant becomes probably the most influential idea. By the late Second Temple period, this was more or less the standard way of understanding what it meant to be a Jew.
Yeah, there's many law codes. There's a few obviously very major law codes. Deuteronomy is probably the most influential, certainly of the law codes, and maybe conceptually of all of the texts of the Pentateuch.